Well, a very good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to this online assembly. It's been many weeks since we've had an assembly, so I'm absolutely overjoyed to be with you this morning online. And a very sincere word of thanks to your principal, Miss Burnell, for facilitating this online assembly. What I thought we would do this morning is a tour of the church. So I'm just here with Zoe in the grounds of the rectory, and we'll go through the gates and into the church, and I'll show you some of the important things inside the church, their names, and talk a bit about the church for you. So I hope you enjoyed this assembly, this tour of St. Peter's Church. Well, welcome, boys and girls, here to St. Peter's Church in Mountrath. I know it's a very familiar sight to you all because it's just across the road from your school, and you see it every morning on your way to school. You also see it here in the town because it's right in the centre, right in the heart of Mountrath. So I know it's a very familiar sight to you. It's also a very important place for you because so many important services throughout your year at school are held here in the church. You might remember most recently you had the World Day of Prayer service, and you celebrated that with the children of Zimbabwe. You had the church beautifully and colourfully decorated for the World Day of Prayer, like you do every year. And you also gather here each year for the end of year school service. Now, please God, we'll be able to gather again this year for the end of year service. We don't know yet when that will be possible, but you might remember past end of year services where you gathered with your friends and we said goodbye to the 6th class students as they made their way on to secondary school. So please God, we'll gather again here in the church soon enough. But as you come in the front door of the church, you come into the church, this is the first thing that you'll see, and I know you all know what it's called. It's called a baptismal font. Now, font is an unusual word, and I have my blackboard here, and see I have F-O-N-T, but I've left a space. So this is the word font, but I've left a space, and the reason I've done that is I'm going to add in another letter, the letter U, so font then becomes fount. So you can see why we call this a baptismal font. It comes from the word fount. It's an old word, and a fount is where water bubbles up to the surface and flows out either from a well or a river, and that's the font or the source of the water. And that's why we have a baptismal font, because as you know, when you were a little baby, you were baptized, or maybe you've also been to a baptism in recent times and you've seen a baby or an adult being baptized, and water is poured on them here at the font. And I'll just put the blackboard away, and I'll just lift the lid off the font. So the font is a big bowl, and it'll be filled with water, and the priest will take some of the water here in the baptismal font and he pours it on the head of the candidate. That's the person who's about to be baptized, whether they're a baby or someone older. And the priest will say, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And at that moment you become a member of the Christian family, the Christian church, the Christian faith, the Christian religion. And that is the reason why the baptismal font is always at the back of a church. Now, some churches have moved the baptismal font up to the front, but it should be at the back of the church. And the reason for that is because it marks for us the beginning of our journey as a Christian, when we first became a member of the Christian church, when we were baptized. So every Sunday or any day when we come into the church and we see the font at the back of the church, it reminds us that this is where our journey as a Christian began, when our parents, our family, brought us here to the church to be baptized. Now, there's also something else important, and that is this. This is actually an Easter candle, or more correctly we call it the Paschal Candle. Now, Paschal is another unusual word, and it comes to us from the Hebrew language, and it comes from the word Passover. Now, you might be familiar with the word Passover, because in the Gospels we read about Jesus and his 12 disciples, his 12 apostles, his 12 important friends, when they gathered in Jerusalem and they celebrated the Passover. And Jewish people today still celebrate the Passover. They remind themselves of the time when Moses was led by God out of the land of Egypt, and he took all the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt back to Israel, and they were able to live freely in Israel once again. So they left Egypt with Moses and went to the land of Israel. So Passover is a very important time for Jews, and that is usually occurs around the time of Easter. Not always at exactly the same time, but usually they're around the same time of the year. And so when Jews gather to celebrate Passover, Christians gather to celebrate Easter. And at Easter, on a day called Easter Eve, which is a Saturday, it's before Easter Day. Easter Day is the Sunday, Easter Sunday. And on Easter Eve, Christians all over the world gather for what's called the Easter Vigil. And this year we had our Easter Vigil on the radio from St. Fintan's Church, just down the road there in the town of Mountrath. And this candle was lit for the first time at the Easter Vigil. A vigil is a time of prayer when people come together to wait for something important to happen. And Christians gather at the Easter Vigil to remember when Christ rose from the dead and rose to new life and granted us new life as well. So we light this special candle throughout the year. It's lit for the first time at the Easter Vigil, that's on Easter Eve, the Saturday before Easter. And it's put on a very special stand. And here in St. Peter's Church, it's kept at the front of the church, because again, when we come into the church, we see the font reminding us where we became a Christian, and the light of Christ burning at the front of the church. And if we have a baptism, we take the Paschal Candle on its stand and we place it here in this little baptismal area, again to remind us of the presence of Christ. Now, just before we go up to the front of the church, I'll just show you some other things that you'll find here at the back of the church. Most importantly is our prayer book. This is the Book of Common Prayer, or the prayer book, and it contains all the words of our special services right here in the prayer book. It contains the words of morning prayer, of evening prayer, of the late evening office or night prayer. It contains the words of Holy Communion. It contains all 150 of the Psalms. They're the special songs in the Bible called the Psalms. And it contains the words of many important prayers for us as Christians, like the Lord's Prayer. So you'll see prayer books at the back of the church. They're usually green in colour. Sometimes they're a red, burgundy type colour. And there's newer prayer books now which are blue in colour, but they're more familiar to us as the green prayer book. So when you come into the church, if you don't have your own prayer book, one of the church wardens will give you a prayer book. And the church warden is a special person who welcomes people here to the church. So you'll see the church wardens here in St. Peter's are Emily and Tommy, and you'll see them on a Sunday morning, and they welcome you to the church. And one of the other books they'll give you, if you don't have your own, is this red book, and it's called the Hymnal, and it contains lots and lots of hymns. Now, hymn is another unusual word, H-Y-M-N, and it comes to us from the Greek language, and a hymn to Greeks is a special song sung in honour of somebody. So we sing special songs or hymns in honour of God, and that's the red hymnal, the green prayer book, which you receive when you come into the church. Now we'll make our way up to the front of the church. Now, boys and girls, we're gradually moving our way to the front of the church. You'll see the baptismal font down there at the back of the church as you enter the church. And this is what's called the aisle. So this is where we walk up to the front of the church. And this particular part of the church, this whole section of the building here, is called the nave. Now that's another unusual word. and that comes to us from the Latin language, and that means boat. You might be familiar with the word navigate. So the reason it's called the boat or the nave is because in ancient times they thought it was shaped a bit like a boat and where people gathered. So this is where people sit in what are called pews. These are special seats or benches in a church. And pew is another unusual word. And we get the word pew from that part of the church up there on a height, which is called the gallery. But in ancient times, that was called a pew. It was a French word, and it just meant a gallery, which was a high area off the ground. And that's normally where the choir would sit. So it would be called the choir gallery, or in the ancient French it was called the pew. And there were no seats at all in churches back then. There was nowhere to sit. There were no pews. So people had to stand in church. But what the choir could do is, because there were steps in the gallery where the choir were sitting right up there, they sometimes for a rest they would sit on the steps, and that's where we get the word for seats in the church, which are the pews, because they come from when the choir would sit on the steps, which were called pews. So I hope that's been interesting. Now, this is a map, or a plan rather, of the church from above. If you were up in a helicopter or an aeroplane looking down on St. Peter's Church or any other church, this is exactly what you'll see. This is our plan of St. Peter's. Now, if I turn it like that, you'll see that it's in the shape of a cross. And at the very top of the cross is the area just behind us there, which I'll show you in a moment. But we see there north, south, east and west. Now, this is the most important part of the church. I'm going to show you that in just a second. And the reason this part of the church is always at the east is because, as you probably know, the sun rises in the east. So every morning when the sun first comes out, when the sun begins to appear in the sky, it rises in the east. And as you know, Jesus is the Son of God. So that's why for Christians, we put this end of the church at the east to remind us of the Son of God, or like the sun rising in the sky, like Jesus did at Easter. So I'm going to show you now the important part of the church, which is just behind us. So I'll turn the camera around for you. Yeah. Now, so this area behind us is the eastern part of the church, the very top of the cross. And this area of the church is called the chancel, or it's also called the sanctuary. And sanctuary is a word meaning holy. So it's an important part of the church. I'm not sure if you can see on the camera there, but there's a step up here. And there's another step up here. And finally, a third step up here. And the reason there are 3 steps is because of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So always we have 3 steps at the top of the church leading into the sanctuary. So step 1, the Father. Step 2, the Son. And step 3, the Holy Spirit. And here we have the Holy Table, or the Communion Table. And this is where Holy Communion is celebrated. The bread and wine for our Holy Communion are there. And the reason the Holy Communion table is at this important part of the church is, like the Baptismal Font, begins our journey as Christians. Our journey as a Christian continues right up to the communion table where we receive Holy Communion. So that's the important journey of the life of a Christian, becoming a member of the church. And then at our confirmation, when the bishop puts his hands on our head and confirms our faith, our belief in God, our belief in Jesus Christ, and we receive Holy Communion for the first time. And that is why the Holy Communion table is in this important part of the church. And you'll see the communion rails there. They're those wooden rails where people kneel at. I'll just do that. So you're probably familiar either yourself when you come to church on a Sunday at Holy Communion, you come up here and kneel. And if you haven't been confirmed, you receive a blessing. And if you have been confirmed, you receive the bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ. Now, I'll just move the camera again for you. I'll just point it up to this important structure here. Now, that is called the pulpit. I'll just steady the camera for you there, boys and girls. Sorry about this. Now, so I'm standing in the pulpit. I'll just crouch down a little because I'm not sure if the camera can see me this high. This is called the pulpit, and that is a Latin word that means platform. So the pulpit is where the gospel is proclaimed from. We don't read the gospel, we proclaim the gospel. So the gospel is proclaimed from here. The minister or the priest reads the gospel and proclaims it to the people. So as I say, proclaim is a special word for reading or speaking out loud. So we proclaim the gospel from an important point which is raised up, and that's called the pulpit or the platform. So I'll just come back down. Now, just there in front of me and in front of the communion table is a lectern, and that's where our notices are read from. And if I move the camera over here, we see in the shape of an eagle another lectern, and this is where the readings are read from. So a reader comes up to this lectern and reads the readings on a Sunday from there. And the reason it's in the shape of an eagle is because the eagle is a special bird. It's a very large bird, and early Christians were fascinated by the eagle soaring in the air. So they associated the eagle with Christ, and the eagle is also associated with St. John, who wrote one of the Gospels. So that's why the lectern, where the readings are from, is in the shape of an eagle. A lectern there where notices are read from, and then the pulpit where the gospel is proclaimed from. I'll just lift the camera out of its stand now, and there is the organ, and that's where the organist sits. And here in St. Peter's, our organist is usually Mabel on a Sunday, or sometimes Serena, and they will play the organ. And in days past, up there in the choir gallery would have been the choir, or indeed in this part of the church where they could see the organist as well. So there's another gallery there too. But usually on a Sunday now our choir sits here. I'll just move the camera over to here, and this is what's called a side chapel. That's a portion of a church that's set aside also for services. And there you see another communion table. We have a lectern and a prayer desk where the leader of the service sits, and that's either the minister or one of the lay readers or ministers in our diocese would sit if they're leading the service. So we see there the prayer book on a stand on the communion table here in this side chapel. And sometimes churches will have a side chapel just for small gatherings or services that don't attract a lot of people, or usually early morning services and that. And so in St. Peter's Church we have a weekday service sometimes, and that's held here in the side chapel. Now, so there again we have the communion table, the cross on top of what's called the rear dos. That's the rear dos, the very, very back of the church. It just means rear of the church. And there now a special little visitor. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen this guy before. He's visiting us from England. He doesn't have a name yet. We'll have to give him a name in due course, this little Teddy, but he's visiting us from England and on a journey with us here in the parish. So I'll bring him to the school when the school is back, give you a chance to meet him. So this is the sanctuary area of the church. And now look back down to where we entered the church. Now I'll just pop the camera back in its stand. Oh. Oops. Well, that gave you a chance to see the roof of the church, but I'll just come around to the front of you now. And now, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed that tour of the church. Again, a sincere thanks to your principal, Miss Burnell, for facilitating me this morning to lead you in this assembly. It's a delight to be back with you again. I know you're probably hoping to be back to school soon, and please God, you will be. And so in the meantime, I wish you all very well. And we'll just close now by saying, as we usually do at our assembly, the school prayer and the Lord's Prayer. So our school prayer. This is our school. Let peace dwell here. Let the room be full of contentment. Let love abide here. Love of one another. Love of life itself. And love of God. Amen. And now the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Boys and girls, God bless. My best wishes to all your families, and I hope you all keep well and safe, and that you'll be back to school, please God, soon again. Bye-bye.